This PowerPoint is going to focus on World War II in the European theater. This, of course, is made up of the Allies, which at the time were the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. Now, Russia was busy fighting their own part of the war against the Nazis. However, in North Africa, in Italy, the combined British and American forces were fighting against fascist Italy as well as Nazi Germany. And today we're actually going to have some video clips kind of mixed in with the notes today. So you got a little bit of a break from some of the reading. So I found some footage of some of the stuff and some dramatic footage to kind of mix this up a little bit. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Where we really kick off the European theater is in 1943. Now, of course, the war in Europe had been already a couple years old, but now the United States really gets involved. And in Tehran, Iran, the big three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union get together. And of course, is represented by these three leaders. And you're going to see them kind of dramatized here in a minute as well, with Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union on the left, FDR from the United States in the center, and Winston Churchill on the right. And essentially what they got together to do here was to talk about how they were going to beat the two fascist powers in Europe. You of course had Russia having to have fought this on the other side for some time, and now was seeking the help of Great Britain and the United States. And here we are kind of seeing that dramatized between the big three. And essentially what it was decided was that along with the American effort coming up through North Africa, which at the time this meeting takes place is already happening, the United States, British, Canadian, Australian, and several other members of the British Empire all were going to team up together and eventually invade France to open up officially a Western front. And that was the beginning of what we know today as Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord was the official code name given to the operation that would begin a Western front, primarily to liberate France and then essentially squash Germany in the center. Now, by this time, the German advance into Russia had already been halted. And in addition to agreeing to this plan, Stalin also committed the Soviet Union, the USSR, to end the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. So we're starting to see the Allies, start to work together here, really to eventually crush not only one but all of the Axis powers. The Axis, of course, was Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Now, as we mentioned, at the same time this was happening, we also have what was beginning in North Africa. Remember, back in the mid-30s, Italy had invaded Ethiopia. And so now, not really able to defend themselves against the British, the Nazis were now, Nazi Germany, German forces were having to go down there and essentially defend what their partners, Italy, had taken. And this really begins the big battle in the desert. And as you can see in that map, it takes place all along North Africa, throughout Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, all these areas. This becomes known as Operation Torch, and it is eventually aided by the Americans as well. But the two primary commanders in this were the two gentlemen you see down there at the bottom. You have the British general Bernard Montgomery, otherwise just known as Monty to his friends, and then you had the genius German commander known as Erwin Rommel. He was nicknamed the Desert Fox because of how good he could use tank divisions down in that part of the world. Once the Americans and British began to show up in force, ultimately it led to a German retreat out of this area. And they had to abandon North Africa. North Africa really wasn't ever a really big goal, but the reason why they were down there was because, of course, one of the Axis powers, Italy, had started down there. Also, the Americans really needed to get their act together. North Africa was kind of seen as, it's hard to say this, but essentially practice. A lot of veteran soldiers who would later end up fighting in Europe had experiences first fighting down in North Africa. Now, once the Germans and the Italians had been beat in North Africa, it was only a hop, skip, and a jump away to go to the next target, which in this case was Italy, considered the weakest of the three Axis powers. And if you see in the map there, Italy, the boot of Italy, just is a short distance away. And so the Americans would then march up through Italy, and unfortunately the Italian campaign ended up being a very a very slow and painful campaign, primarily because along almost the entire length of Italy are mountain ranges. And those mountain ranges slowed down the Allied progress up through Italy. But, and the Germans really made the Americans and the other allies pay for every foot that they were able to take up through Italy. Ultimately, though, the campaign was a success, and they were able to get up into Italy. And this is the landing in Sicily that you see here, that eventually led to the attack in Italy. And what we see there is really the beginning of the end for the Axis powers, especially in Europe. It isn't too after that Mussolini is actually overthrown and chased out of power. Later on, we'll see what ends up happening to him. But he tried to escape. That was unsuccessful. But essentially, by September of that year, the Italian campaign was a success. So slowly, bit by bit, they're homing in on Germany and slowly trying to progress towards Germany. Now, all the while, there is a pretty definite feeling that potentially the Allies could land somewhere in France. And in fact, the Allies create this entire phony army, commanded supposedly by George Patton, who was the blood and guts, tank commander that the Americans had, and they let it leak that he was in command of this entire army, when in reality, all of this was phony. And we've got some footage here that you guys are going to see, and we'll really show you. And essentially, they were dummy tanks. They brought in Hollywood personnel to create the illusion that all of this stuff existed. All of this was designed to fool Hitler into thinking that the landing was going to take place somewhere other than where it was actually going to take place. So this is what, Hitler and the Nazis saw from the sky. Just this, huge buildup of supplies. Looks enormous, right? Watch this. It's a blow-up balloon. And watch this. Looks like a tank, doesn't it? Yeah. Whoop! Over it goes. Yeah. As it turns out, it was all a fake. It was one huge fake out. And you can see them here blowing up a tank. Sorry guys, this is from a documentary. I meant to cut that little section out. But yeah, this guy gets under it, and there goes the tank. And there's the kind of the map of where they were hoping Hitler would think where it was actually going to land. So it gives you an idea of, what they were going through in order to make Hitler think they were landing one place when in reality they were going to land it someplace else. They were trying to get the Germans to believe that they were going to be landing at Calais. And the reason why Calais is because that's the place in France that's the shortest distance away from Great Britain, where they are now building up the Allied forces. When in reality, they are planning on landing someplace else. Someplace far more challenging, actually, than Calais. But it is intended to fake the Germans out. Where they really plan on landing is a place called Normandy. And this became Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord was masterminded by General Dwight Eisenhower. That's a name you're going to need to remember later on because he becomes President of the United States. And he is the overall commander. And what really is the idea here is to land at these beaches along Normandy. Normandy was divided up into beaches. Each of these beaches were given code names. Code names like Juno, Sword, Utah, Omaha, Gold. In fact, those are the 5 beaches. As you guys can see, the flags represent the different armies that were going to take care of those beaches. The 2 largest areas, which were called Utah and Omaha beaches, were going to be taken by the United States. Now, the reason why this was where they were going to land was because the beach here was extremely gentle, meaning it extends far out into the water, which means you can be a long ways from shore and still have your feet on the beach. And as a result, it was really good for landing crafts, what the Americans called Higgins boats. These boats that essentially was just a big wood box with soldiers in it, motor in the back, and a drawbridge down the front. And essentially what you would have is the Higgins boat would plop up on the beach, drop the drawbridge, and down the soldiers went. And that was the plan. The Germans also knew this, and so they planted all kinds of roadblocks in their way. The beach was littered with mines and these big iron crosses to rip the holes in boats. Hopefully later today, you guys are also going to take a look at the video that I've posted about D-Day, and you'll see and hear all the different obstacles that the Germans had placed in the way of people they knew that would probably invade at that point. And in fact, the defenses were so substantial, they were called the Atlantic Wall. And this Atlantic Wall was not only made of stuff on the beach, but actual concrete bunkers that were placed on hillsides just behind the beach. And in there were soldiers with rifles and guns, as well as cannons, all zeroed in on that beach. So if anything landed there, they knew exactly how far it was. Well, on June 6th, 1944, the D-Day plan is put into action. And ironically, just about everything goes wrong. Um, I really encourage you guys to watch the clip from the war. It is part of one of your assignments this week, and in that assignment, you guys will see some pretty extensive footage the um, of the D-Day campaign. And essentially, what you had, first of all, you had people flying over um, the during the night, um, and then they were dropping paratroopers, people behind the lines. Then you had bombers bombing all along the Atlantic Wall. Then you had the soldiers landing on the morning of June 6th. And here we go. The guys in the Higgins boats, they're headed towards the D-Day, the beach on D-Day. And you can see them, they're all getting ready. There are the planes, there are the paratroopers flying overhead. This actually happened at night. The whole front was just barraged with all kinds of artillery. And the idea here was to simply just overwhelm the defenses. And there's one of the pillboxes. That's what the Germans call these concrete bunkers. And some of the most experienced German soldiers were placed in this area. And they were just waiting for when eventually someone would come. But they had no idea that it was going to be this many. And so when the literally hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers landed on the beach, they couldn't defend it. The Allies were able to break through and establish a beachhead. In other words, they were able to hold the beach. They defeated the German forces on the beach, and also be able to start moving inwards using the beach as kind of a base of operations. Thus the term beachhead. And so the D-Day campaign, which actually almost was a failure. In fact, a lot of the objectives of destroying a lot of the German forces before the soldiers would actually land on the beach, a lot of those objectives weren't met, and the soldiers just had to take that stuff on head on. And that's why the casualties were so high. This really began the end of the German domination in Western Europe. But the German army definitely had something left to give. And they gave it all in December of 44. So June, 6 months earlier, the Americans land at Normandy in France. 6 months later, the Germans decide in the dead of winter to throw everything they've got at the Allied forces. The Allied forces were starting to move into France, and this huge forested area that kind of divides France and Germany. This area is known as the Ardennes, and it's in an area next to a town in Belgium called Bastogne. And this is another clip from the war that I encourage you guys to watch. Again, it is an assignment. It's connected to one of the 2 readings this week. So I encourage you guys to watch that. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, was the result of this massive counterattack on the part of the Nazis versus primarily the Americans, but also British forces moving eastward, headed towards Germany. And they were actually able to push the Allies back so far that it caused literally this bulge in the Allied lines, thus the term. Well, this town called Bastogne was in the middle of that bulge, and in fact, American paratroopers who were stationed there to defend the town actually found themselves surrounded. Now, for those of you who have ever seen the miniseries Band of Brothers, this is the story of these guys. I've actually been there. I've actually been to Bastogne. It is quite a place, and you definitely see the thanks and gratitude of the town even today to Americans and the sacrifice that was made on behalf of these people. And the Americans are later saved by General Patton's tanks, who are basically, they're moving up through Italy, they're moving up north, and by the time they get there, the Allies have figured out how to resupply their soldiers, kind of caught behind enemy lines there, but there was really no way for them to get out. And Patton really shows up and kind of saves the day, although they don't want to admit ever that they needed saving, but they were saved. This is the second of what would be three meetings. The first one we saw at the beginning of the PowerPoint in Tehran. This is the second. This was called Yalta. The Yalta meeting takes place in 1945, and Yalta is in Germany, and Yalta is where the big three meet for the last time in this configuration, because the next time they meet, a lot of the faces will have changed, and you're going to see why here at the end of the PowerPoint, and the one that we'll look at when we look at the Pacific Theater. It's really here that they decide the fate of what's going to happen, primarily in Western Europe, and a little bit about what's going to happen to Japan. One thing to decide here is that they will accept nothing except Germany's unconditional surrender. Now, this is a big difference between World War II and World War I. At the end of World War I, there were a bunch of conditions that the Allies were allowing the Germans to have at the end of the war. They got to keep their colors and guns and all this kind of stuff, and they said, no, this is an unconditional surrender that they are demanding of Germany. Now, by this time, it's on its way. This is in February of 1945. The war really doesn't have much longer to go. At the end of the Battle of the Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans really don't have much to give. In fact, during that battle, they were throwing in kids and old men as soldiers, because they just didn't have any men left. They barely had enough gasoline to fuel their cars. However, more importantly, it's at the Yalta conference between these three leaders that they decide what's going to happen after the war is over. One of the big decisions they make is that Germany itself is going to be divided into these 4 military zones, because this is the second war that has been fought where Germany was the aggressor. They wanted to make sure that was never going to happen again. Another big agreement that is come to at the end of at this meeting is an agreement to form a United Nations, an international body that will be able to at least act as a sounding board in the future to possibly prevent future wars. It is still around today. All the while this is happening, we have happening in the background one of the worst human tragedies in human history. And that is, of course, the Holocaust. This was the intentional and mechanized and incredibly well organized. And when I say well, I mean the organizational skills that were used to systematically wipe out entire portions of the population in Europe were absolutely staggering. The result was somewhere around 10 to 12 million people were killed in a relatively short period of time. Now, although Americans knew they had some idea of what was going on, they had no idea what they were in for. A lot of Americans had heard of weird vanishings happening throughout Europe where people just disappeared. They had no idea where they went. They had heard of these huge, almost military-esque encampments where people were being sent to, but they really didn't know what they were. In fact, the famous Auschwitz, I should say infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, was thought to be by the American military as a military base, because they saw the barracks, they saw them organized in a very military fashion, they saw the railroad lines coming in and out. They had no idea that this, what you guys are seeing right now, is what was actually happening. See, imagine seeing that view from the sky, which is all the Americans had. Now, it wasn't until the American soldiers started to actually funnel in and start to invade different parts of Germany and Russia. Russian soldiers actually were invading from the east, and so they were coming through Eastern Europe, places like Poland and parts of Czechoslovakia, where a lot of these camps were found. Did they find what was actually going on? And of course, the German soldiers were ordered to do this. And in local towns, they claimed they had no idea what was going on, but they knew. They knew. There is a selection, again, from the war that focuses on the Holocaust, and it is one of the assignments from this week. So please make sure that you watch it. The Holocaust, as we know, targeted the systematic extermination of various groups designated by the Nazi government as undesirables, targeted mostly an ethnic group called Gypsies, or the Romani, as well as Jews. However, it did include other groups. Homosexuals were actually a group, but that's actually come under suspicion because it's actually been discovered that several German officers were actually gay. So that's a little dicey as far as how accurate that is. But they were listed as unmentionables or undesirable people. But the point here is that it happened, as the title of the video you guys will see this week is called. As the war ends, history, it seems, starts to tie up loose ends. In April of 1945, April 12th, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. The president who had led the United States through the Depression and most of World War II was now dead. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, now found himself in a position where he had to finish up both of these two wars. About a week later, on April 28th, Benito Mussolini, and his wife, by the way, are taken out, shot, dragged through the streets of Rome, and then hung upside down. Boy, you gotta give it to the Italians. They know how to do it right. That's what they did with Mussolini. 2 days later, Adolf Hitler shoots himself. Now, in addition, by this time, the leader of the militarists in Japan, Hideki Tojo, had stepped down from power. Later on, he commits harikiri, which is ritual suicide. In addition, in Great Britain, Winston Churchill is actually voted out of power, though it hasn't quite happened yet, but it happens very soon. So it seems as though history is kind of, removing the great leaders who had led these countries into World War II and was getting the world ready for another generation. In other words, what was going to happen after World War II? Well, we don't know yet, because even though Germany officially surrenders on May 7th, 1945, and the following day, May 8th, is celebrated as VE Day, or Victory in Europe, there is still another war raging on in the East. And that is, of course, the war with the Japanese. And so we will see what happens there in our next and last PowerPoint. All right, folks, please make sure that your notes are all done. You, of course, can look back at your PDFs to check up on anything that you missed, and of course, take a look at the summary here, focusing primarily on political change. We're looking at military actions that the United States took, and of course, this did not only include war, but also included, of course, political maneuvering with its allies and trying to figure out how was this all going to come to an end. How was this eventually going to get wrapped up, and more importantly, what kind of efforts were being made to make sure something like this was never going to happen again.